Lost hours can be the single greatest expense you've got in your company. If you're not tracking it, it gets out of control really, really quick. But if you're not tracking it, how do you know how many lost hours you have? That will be the topic of this week's Planning for Profit Minute. We provided a tool in the Planning for Profit software to give you an idea of what you have for lost hours versus billable hours. Again, remember, those lost hours are the single greatest expense you have in your company. So where you find this tool is simply under the calculator section in the software itself. And when I go in there, I'm going to see the option for lost hours. Now, when you choose this, it's simply going to send you out to another calculator that's on our website. And it's just a quick, very simple tool to help you try and figure out roughly how many lost hours do I have. There's really two variables that we need to know. If we know what the total revenue was for that department over a given period of time and what your material costs are for that same period of time, we can tell you how many hours you were paid for and therefore how many hours are lost. So I'm going to look at a service department over the course of a year. I simply look at my P&L from last year and I see that we've done roughly $350,000 in total revenue, and our material cost for that same time period is about $42,000. I simply come into my calculator right here, and we're going to blow that up just a little bit for you so you can see it a little bit easier. And I'll simply come in here and I'm going to put in my total revenue of $350,000. I'll tab down, what was my material cost for that same time period? I said it was $42,000. Now, remember, you can use this calculator, at least the majority of it, for any time period you want. If you wanted to check for a week, a day, if you wanted to look for, at a month, you can certainly do that as well. If you do that, if you use any time period other than a year, well, the lower couple of items on here won't apply to you. They apply if we're using an entire year, as we're doing in this particular case. So we've got our total sales, our total revenues for this department. We've got our total cost of the materials that we used. Now we're going to come down and we're going to enter in what is our either material markup or margin, whichever you use. You'll use one or the other. You won't use both. Now remember, a material markup is if you're using cost times a multiplier, right? So cost times 1.5 would be a 50% markup. If you use a divisor, which would be like cost divided by 0.5 or 0.6, then at that point in time, that's going to be a material margin. In my particular case, I'm using a 50% margin. So I'm basically doubling the price of my parts. And so when I enter that in, you can see that material sales, I'm paying $42,000 for these materials. We're using a 50% margin, which basically doubles the price. I'm going to sell those materials for $84,000. Now, the next field that we're going to enter in is what is your target labor rate. See, again, you can't calculate. One of the reasons many companies, let's say, don't track these hours is because it's hard to calculate. Right? Well, my technician discounted the invoice, right? Or he didn't charge the full labor rate. So how do I really figure out what that is? That's the beauty of this little calculator, is it will always get you back to your target material markup or margin and your target labor rate. So in my particular case, we're charging $125 per hour for our labor. That tells me that we got paid for 2,128 hours for this period of time. Now, if you were looking at this over a period of a week, well, that you know that, okay, how many guys did I have, right? I'm simply going to divide this by the number of technicians that we got, and it'll tell us how many hours we were paid for over that time period. You'll compare that to your payroll data, and anything greater than that number is non-billable time. Now, since I'm using annual data in here, I can go ahead and use the bottom three areas. So in my case, how many techs do I have? I've got 2 service techs running these service calls. That tells me that each technician, right, billable hours per tech, each tech billed out 1,064 hours, and each tech had 1,016 lost hours based on a 40-hour work week. Now, if they're working something more or less than that, you're going to have to, again, go back and adjust that number. But again, it tells you at that point how many lost hours you had per technician. Now, again, let's say you're looking at this over the course of a month, 4 weeks. Well, okay, if I had 2,128 hours, divide that by my number of technicians, it tells me how many billed hours per tech. Then again, anything above that you paid the technician for was all non-billable time. So again, it's just a quick, easy tool to give you an idea if you have no clue what you actually have for non-billable time, to give you that idea. Now, again, I can also simply look at this point and say, okay, my non-billable hours here was 1,016. Total billable was 1,064. So if I look at that and what percentage of their time was non-billable, well, at that point, I can simply say 1,016, again, looking at the total hours, plus the billable time of 1,064, right, tells me that we actually paid them for 2,080 hours. And so if I take my non-billable time, 1,016, divided by my 2,080 total hours, tells me that this particular technician, 48.8% of his time was non-billable or lost. So now I could go back into my software and literally go into cost input, go into that individual technician. And again, in this particular case, I can see that this tech, when we put him in, we had him in, he was only at 36% non-billable. It tells me that the information here is not accurate. I actually need to increase his lost hours, and I'll do that simply by going into the input hours and increase the lost hours there. Hope that was helpful. That is this week's Planning for Profit Minute.